The war did not end when the train arrived. It did not end when people smiled. It did not end when hands reached out to welcome him home. The war ended for everyone else. For him, it followed. He stood on the platform while the noise swelled around him. Cheers, laughter, music, the sound of relief, the sound of closure. He felt none of it. His body remained tense, every muscle prepared for something that no longer had a name. They said he was safe now. His body did not believe them. The first thing he noticed was how exposed he felt. There was no cover here, no shadows to hide in, no instinctive awareness of where danger might come from. Home was open, wide, loud, and somehow more frightening than any battlefield he could remember. People hugged him. They spoke quickly, nervously, filling the air with words as if silence might reveal something they were not ready to face. He smiled because it was expected, because smiling required less explanation than truth. Truth had become complicated. The train had carried him through landscapes untouched by destruction, fields still green, houses still standing, roads uninterrupted. It disturbed him more than ruins ever had. It meant the world had continued while he had been frozen somewhere else, living inside a reality that no longer existed. When he finally entered the house, the familiarity struck him harder than he expected. The same walls, the same narrow hallway, the same creaking floorboard near the door. Time had stopped here. It waited patiently for his return, unaware that the person who had left would never come back. That first night, he did not sleep. He rested with his eyes closed, listening. Every sound carried weight. A shifting beam, a distant vehicle, wind against the window. His body responded automatically, heart racing, breath shallow, muscles tight. In the war, this reaction had kept him alive. At home, it only reminded him that something inside him refused to stand down. When sleep finally came, it arrived violently, not as rest, but as fragments. He felt pressure before he saw anything, weight on his chest, cold against his skin, the certainty that something was wrong without knowing what it was. He woke suddenly, disoriented, unsure of where he was or when he had arrived there. Morning felt unreal. Light filtered through the window in a way that seemed too gentle, too forgiving. He washed his face and studied his reflection. The man staring back looked ordinary enough, older, thinner, but intact. It bothered him. The outside did not match the inside. He dressed carefully. Routine mattered. During the war, routine had been survival. Now it was control. People asked questions. They always did. What was it like? Were you scared? Did you see terrible things? He learned quickly how to answer without answering. A few vague phrases, a quiet smile, a pause that discouraged follow-up. Silence became his most reliable defense. Words had power. Too much power. Words opened doors he had sealed shut. Behind those doors were moments that did not fit into peaceful rooms or polite conversations. He had learned that speaking was dangerous, not because others would judge him, but because he could not predict what would surface once he began. Food sat heavily in his stomach. He ate slowly, aware of every bite. Full meals felt undeserved. Comfort felt wrong. There was a quiet calculation happening in his mind that never stopped, comparing what he had now to what others had lost. Why him? Why now? Why here? He tried to return to work. Structure helped. The predictability of tasks gave his mind something to anchor itself to. For a while it worked. Hours passed without incident. He almost believed he could settle back into a life that made sense. Then the cracks appeared. A sudden noise made his hands tremble before he realized why. A raised voice tightened his chest. Small disruptions triggered reactions that felt disproportionate, and uncontrollable. He saw the confusion on people's faces when he withdrew or tensed, and he hated himself for it. Anger surfaced unexpectedly. Not loud, not violent, but sharp and sudden. It came without warning and disappeared just as quickly, leaving shame in its place. He did not recognize this version of himself. That frightened him more than anything else. No one had prepared him for this war. The one without uniforms, the one without clear objectives, the one fought entirely inside his own body. At night, memory returned quietly, not as scenes but as sensations. A pressure in the chest, a hollow feeling behind the eyes, a sudden awareness of absence. Names he refused to say, faces he could not forget. He avoided mirrors on those nights, not because he did not recognize the man looking back, but because he did. He saw the distance, the separation, the version of himself that had stayed behind somewhere else. People assumed time would fix it. Time fixes most things. He let them believe that. It was easier than explaining that time had become meaningless. Days passed, weeks blurred together. The war had taught him how to endure long stretches of waiting without resolution. The world moved on. It always did. Streets filled again, businesses reopened, conversations shifted toward the future. He watched it happen as though from behind glass. Families gathered. Children laughed. Life insisted on continuing. He felt like a visitor in his own existence, present but detached, participating without belonging. Peace felt unpredictable. In the war, every decision had been simple: live or die, move or stay, obey or fall. At home, choices multiplied endlessly. Each one carried weight. Each one demanded a version of himself he no longer trusted. There were moments when calm almost settled in, moments when he felt close to something resembling normal. He learned not to trust them. The war had taught him that calm often preceded chaos. He did not consider himself broken. Broken things could be repaired. He felt altered, permanently reshaped by something that could not be undone. No one could see the scars that mattered most. The battlefield had taken pieces of him, but home revealed the absence. It showed him what could not be returned, what no parade or speech could restore. The war had ended for the world. For him, it had only found a quieter place to live. And this was only the beginning.
When the transport finally moved away from the place that had defined him for years, he did not feel relief. There was no internal release, no sense of arrival into something safer or lighter. The distance between himself and the war increased, but the war did not recede with it. It remained present, not as memory, but as structure. The routine stayed intact. He woke before he needed to. He listened for sounds that no longer mattered. He scanned spaces automatically, measuring angles, exits, distances, even when nothing required it. His body remained alert in environments that posed no threat. This vigilance had nowhere to go. The men around him began to change more visibly now. Laughter returned. Voices grew louder. Conversations expanded beyond necessity. Plans were spoken aloud, casually, as if the future had been waiting patiently for permission to resume. He observed this with quiet distance, not judgment. Distance. The closer they moved toward home, the more foreign the idea became to him. Home had existed for years only as a reference point, a word attached to letters and imagined moments. Now that it approached, it felt abstract, unprepared, insufficient. He wondered, without fully articulating it, whether home would recognize him. The journey itself passed without clear markers. Time stretched and compressed unpredictably. Days blended together, stripped of urgency, stripped of consequence. The absence of immediate requirement unsettled him more than danger ever had. In the war, every moment demanded something. Here, nothing did. This created space, and space allowed accumulation. Memories he had postponed began to surface, not as images, but as sensations. Tightness in the chest, sudden alertness without cause, a sense of readiness that could not be discharged. He did not talk about this. There was no framework for it, no shared language. The war had not provided one, and peace did not arrive with instructions. When he finally stepped into the place that was supposed to mark his return, the world felt louder than he remembered. Colors appeared exaggerated. Movements felt inefficient, careless. People occupied space without consideration for exposure or consequence. He noticed how relaxed they were. This did not comfort him. It confused him. They spoke to him with familiarity, with relief, with expectations that felt detached from the reality of what he carried. Their words assumed continuity, as if the man who had left and the man who returned were separated only by time. He recognized the faces. He did not recognize the context. Home was intact. Walls stood where they should. Furniture remained unchanged. The structure had endured. He had not. Days passed in ways that felt unstructured and heavy. There were no clear objectives, no defined outcomes. Decisions that once carried weight now felt arbitrary. The absence of consequence made choice feel meaningless. Sleep did not return the way it was supposed to. When it came, it remained shallow, conditional, easily interrupted. His body did not understand the difference between night and safety. He found himself listening for sounds that never came. And when nothing came, the silence pressed harder. People expected stories. They asked carefully at first, then more openly. What was it like? What happened? What did you see? They asked as if answers would complete something for them. He offered little. Not because he was unwilling, but because translation felt impossible. The language of survival did not convert cleanly into the language of everyday life. Descriptions felt inadequate. Explanations felt dishonest. So he remained quiet. The quiet became noticeable. It unsettled others. Silence always does. It creates space people feel obligated to fill. They spoke around him, over him, for him. They supplied conclusions that required no effort. He let them. Correcting them would have required energy he did not have. As days turned into weeks, the distance between him and those around him grew more defined. They resumed lives that had paused. He attempted to enter a life that no longer aligned with the system inside him. Ordinary interactions demanded responses he no longer practiced. Small frustrations triggered disproportionate reactions. Moments of stillness produced unease rather than rest. He began to realize that the war had trained him for intensity, not continuity. Peace required endurance of a different kind. There were moments, brief and unexpected, when something almost like longing surfaced. Not for the war itself, but for the clarity it imposed, the certainty of purpose, the knowledge that every action mattered, even when the cost was unbearable. Here, meaning felt diluted. If you are still listening, this is where many assume the story resolves. The war is over. The man is home. The outcome appears complete. But this is where the real distance begins. The distance between who he had become and who the world expected him to be. The distance between survival and living. The distance between silence and understanding. He had crossed an ocean. What he had not crossed was himself. And he did not yet know how. The days began to arrange themselves into something resembling routine, but the resemblance was superficial. Structure existed, but meaning did not follow it. He woke, ate when food was placed in front of him, spoke when spoken to, and moved through spaces that expected familiarity he could not supply. People assumed adjustment was a matter of time. Time, they believed, would soften the edges. Time would smooth what the war had sharpened. Time would return him to something recognizable. Time did not do that. Time only created distance between who he was allowed to be during the war and who he was expected to be now. He noticed how easily others transitioned, how quickly the war became something they referenced in past tense, a chapter closed and shelved. For them, memory carried narrative. For him, it carried sensation. Sudden sounds pulled his attention outward before thought could intervene. Crowded rooms narrowed his focus instead of expanding it. Moments meant to be relaxing demanded vigilance he could not disengage. He learned to position himself near exits without realizing he was doing it. He sat where he could see the room. He measured silence the way he once measured terrain. No one had asked him to do this. His body had decided on its own. Conversations moved quickly now. Topics shifted without warning. Humor appeared where he did not expect it, sharp and careless. Laughter arrived unannounced, then vanished just as suddenly. He struggled to participate, not because he lacked understanding, but because the stakes felt wrong. Words were exchanged without consequence. Opinions were offered without calculation. Emotions surfaced without restraint. This felt dangerous. He did not explain this. Explanation required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would have forced him to confront something he had not yet named. He found himself increasingly isolated, not through rejection, but through misalignment. Others moved forward while he remained oriented toward a threat that no longer existed. The absence of immediate danger did not register as safety. It registered as uncertainty. In the war, uncertainty had been external. Here, it was internal. Sleep deteriorated further. Nights stretched into long periods of shallow rest, interrupted by alertness without cause. He woke exhausted, not from exertion, but from the effort of remaining ready in a world that did not require it. The quiet that others welcomed pressed against him. Silence no longer meant nothing was happening. Silence meant something was unresolved. He attempted to fill the days with activity, not for productivity, but distraction. Work provided temporary structure. Tasks offered momentary clarity. But once completed, the emptiness returned. The war had trained him to function under constant demand. Peace offered none. This absence created a question he did not yet know how to answer. Who was he supposed to be when survival was no longer the metric? There were moments when he considered speaking, when he thought about describing the internal tension, the inability to rest, the persistent readiness. Each time, the words felt insufficient, simplified, reduced. He understood instinctively that being heard was not the same as being understood. So he remained silent. If you are still listening, this silence may feel familiar, not because you have been to war, but because you recognize the space between experience and explanation. The place where language fails to translate what has been carried too long. He did not yet see this as something shared. He saw it as something private. As weeks became months, expectations around him hardened. Subtle shifts in tone, in patience, in understanding. The assumption that adjustment should have occurred by now, that gratitude should outweigh difficulty. He felt this pressure, but did not know how to respond to it. Gratitude, as offered, felt misplaced. He was grateful to be alive. He was grateful the war had ended. But gratitude did not erase what had been built inside him. The war had been systematic. Its effects were no less so. He began to realize that the man who returned could not simply resume where he had left off. The continuity others expected did not exist. The gap was not something that could be bridged with effort alone. It required acknowledgement. And acknowledgement required language he did not yet possess. If stories like this matter to you, it is not because they provide answers. It is because they give shape to experiences that are often left unnamed. He did not know it yet, but this recognition would become important. For now, he continued to move through days that demanded less than he was prepared to give and offered more than he could receive. The war was behind him, but the system it had built inside him remained active, searching for purpose in a world that no longer spoke its language. The pressure did not arrive all at once. It accumulated quietly, through expectation rather than demand. People assumed improvement where none had occurred. They spoke as if progress were inevitable, as if time alone corrected imbalance. He did not know how to tell them that time had only widened the gap. What unsettled him most was not misunderstanding, but the gradual erosion of patience around him, the subtle changes in tone, the shortened conversations, the looks that lingered just long enough to suggest concern turning into discomfort. He recognized this shift instinctively. In the war, this was the moment when attention moved elsewhere. Here, it felt like something similar. He became careful about what he revealed, about how much of himself he allowed to surface. Restraint, once a tool for survival, became a method of preservation. He narrowed himself again, not because it was effective, but because it was familiar. This narrowing isolated him further. Social settings demanded responses he could not produce convincingly. Small talk felt like an exercise in disconnection. Emotional cues moved too quickly, shifted without warning, lacked the clarity he depended on. He withdrew without announcing it. Withdrawal did not register as loss at first. It registered as relief. Fewer interactions meant fewer opportunities to fail expectations he did not understand. But relief is temporary. Isolation settles differently. Without external demand, his internal system turned inward with increasing intensity. Thoughts looped without resolution. Memories surfaced without context. Sensations appeared without explanation. He realized that the war had not only trained his body, but disciplined his emotions into silence. That silence had been useful. Now, it was obstructive. There were moments when he attempted to imagine a future that extended beyond adaptation. The exercise felt abstract, unrealistic. The future, as others described it, required a version of himself he did not yet recognize. He began to understand, dimly, that the war had not simply interrupted his life, it had redirected it. This understanding did not bring clarity, it brought weight. The absence of external threat left him exposed to something more persistent, the accumulation of what had been deferred, the cost of sustained restraint. He wondered, often without forming the question fully, whether the man who returned had any obligation to resemble the man who left, whether continuity was necessary or merely expected. No one had prepared him for this phase. There were no instructions for re-entry, no procedures for reintegration. The war had been precise in its demands and indifferent in its aftermath. This was the space left behind, a space where survival no longer provided meaning, but living required something unfamiliar. As time continued, the edges between days softened. Weeks blended into months. The urgency that once governed every decision dissipated, leaving behind a sense of drift that felt more dangerous than immediacy. He was alive, but he was not oriented. The realization that this condition might persist unsettled him more than anything the war had required. Not because it was unbearable, but because it was undefined. Undefined conditions offer no metrics for success. There was no enemy to observe, no terrain to analyze, no moment that clearly signaled resolution. Only the quiet continuation of a system built for another world. He began to understand that what followed the war would not be resolved through effort alone. That adjustment was not a matter of will. That endurance, while necessary, was insufficient. This understanding did not yet change anything, but it marked a shift, the end of expectation, and the beginning of something else. He had survived the war. Now he would have to learn how to survive what came after, and that would take time. Years passed without ceremony. There was no clear moment when things changed, because change did not arrive as an event. It arrived as erosion. Gradual, uneven, almost imperceptible. The kind of shift that can only be seen in retrospect. Time did not restore what had been taken. It rearranged it. The sharp edges softened, but they didn't disappear. They settled deeper, becoming part of the structure that governed how he moved through the world. The vigilance never fully left. It adapted, redirecting itself toward different threats, different uncertainties. He learned how to function. Functioning became the measure of success. He held work. He maintained routines. He occupied space in ways that did not alarm others. From the outside, there was little to indicate disruption. He appeared steady, contained, present. Inside, the war remained active, not as memory, but as reflex. Certain sounds still arrived too quickly. Certain silences still carried weight. Certain moments demanded attention long before thought could intervene. His body continued to respond to stimuli that no longer justified response. He stopped questioning this. Questioning implied the possibility of resolution. Instead, he focused on management. Managing reactions. Managing expectations. Managing the distance between what he felt and what he revealed. The restraint that once kept him alive became the restraint that allowed him to exist without friction. This came at a cost. The cost was connection. Relationships formed slowly, cautiously, often at a distance. Intimacy required a vulnerability that felt incompatible with the system inside him. He offered consistency instead, reliability, presence without disclosure. For some, this was enough. For others, it was not. He learned to accept this without explanation. Explanation suggested a solution. He no longer believed solutions existed in the way people expected them to. There were moments when fragments of the past surfaced unexpectedly. Not images, not scenes, but sensations that carried no clear origin. A tightening, a pause, a readiness that arrived without invitation. These moments passed. They always did. But they left residue. As years accumulated, the war receded further into history for those around him. It became a reference point, an era, a subject for documentaries and commemorations. People spoke of it with distance, with summary, with the comfort of outcome. For him, outcome had never been the point. Survival had not concluded the experience, it had extended it. He noticed that fewer people asked questions now. Curiosity faded with time. Expectations adjusted. Silence became normalized. The absence of explanation was no longer unsettling. This brought a strange form of relief, not because the burden was lighter, but because it no longer required defense. He existed in a space between acknowledgement and obscurity. This space was quieter. In quiet moments, he sometimes considered the version of himself that had left years ago. The one who understood the world differently. The one who believed in continuity. That version felt distant, not lost, but inaccessible. He did not grieve this. Grief suggests finality. This was something else. Acceptance, perhaps. Not acceptance of loss, but acceptance of transformation. The war had shaped him. The years that followed had not undone that shaping. They had integrated it. He was not broken. He was altered. This distinction mattered. Broken things imply repair. Altered things require understanding. Understanding arrived slowly, without declaration. He began to recognize that his experience was not singular, that others carried similar structures beneath functional exteriors. That silence often indicated not absence, but accumulation. This recognition did not demand expression. It offered context. If you are still listening, it is likely because something here feels familiar, not because you share the history, but because you recognize the pattern. The way experience can outpace language, the way survival can create distance, the way time does not erase, but reorganizes. Stories like this are not about war. They are about aftermath. They are about what remains when attention is no longer required, but readiness persists. When identity is reshaped quietly, without witnesses. He did not seek resolution. He learned to coexist with what had been built inside him. That coexistence became his version of peace, not absence of struggle, not return, but continuity. The war ended in history books. For him, it ended differently. It ended as a permanent reference point, embedded beneath daily life, informing decisions without announcing itself. He lived. He adapted. He endured. And in doing so, he carried something forward that most would never see. If stories like this matter to you, it is because they speak to what is rarely acknowledged, the cost that does not appear in records, the scars that do not announce themselves. This channel exists for those stories, not to glorify them, not to resolve them, but to remember them accurately. Some wars never truly end. They simply change form.